Have you ever looked at your growing dog and thought, who are you and what have you done with my puppy? One day, your puppy is checking in with you every few steps on a walk. They're eager to learn, they come running every time you call, they seem to think you're the most interesting thing in the entire world. And then they turn 7 months old. Cut to when you're standing in the backyard calling your dog's name for what feels like the 15th time, and they're giving you that look. You know the look. It's the look that says, I hear you, but have you considered this stick? It's humbling. Maybe they suddenly pull on leash after weeks of walking nicely. They've rediscovered chewing. They're jumping on guests again. They're barking at things they've never seemed to notice before. And despite all the training you've put in, it can feel like they've forgotten everything. If that's where you are right now, I have some good news. Your dog probably isn't being stubborn, they're probably not trying to test you, and they most certainly haven't forgotten everything you've taught them. Chances are you've simply entered into one of the biggest developmental stages of your dog's life: adolescence. It's the canine version of the teenage years, a time when bodies grow quickly, brains are still developing, emotions can run high, and the world suddenly becomes much more interesting than it used to be. It's also one of the stages that catches dog owners the most off guard, because no one really warns you about it. You spend months preparing for puppyhood. You buy the toys, you puppy-proof the house, you read books about potty training and socialization, but then your sweet, attentive puppy starts acting like a completely different dog, and you're left wondering whether you've somehow done something wrong. The truth is, you're not alone. Almost every owner experiences at least one moment where they wonder if their dog has completely lost their mind. The good news? Neither one of you has. Today, we're going to explore what adolescence actually is, what's happening inside your dog's brain during this stage, why certain behaviors seem to appear out of nowhere, and, most importantly, how you can support your dog through these challenging months without losing your patience or your confidence. Because understanding why behavior happens is often the first step toward changing how we respond to it. Let's start by talking about what adolescence actually is and why it's so much more than just a naughty phase. When we think about puppies, we tend to imagine a pretty straightforward path. They grow a little bigger each week, they learn new skills, and eventually they become adults. But development isn't actually that smooth. Just like people, dogs go through different stages of physical, emotional, and mental development, and one of the biggest and often most challenging is adolescence. For many dogs, adolescence begins somewhere around 6 to 12 months of age, though exactly when it starts depends on the individual dog and their breed, and their size. To break things down a bit, for smaller breeds, they often reach this stage around 6 to 8 months. Medium dogs around 6 to 10 months, large dogs 8 to 18 months, while giant breeds may not fully mature until they're 2 to 3 years old. That age range is something worth remembering because adulthood isn't exactly marked by a birthday, it's a developmental process. In fact, many adolescent dogs look almost fully grown. Their legs are longer, their puppy face is disappearing, and people may even assume they're adults. But appearances can be deceiving. If dogs had driver's licenses, adolescence would be the phase where they looked old enough to borrow the car, but you'd still wonder if trusting them with the keys was the right decision. Their bodies may be catching up, but their brains still have plenty of growing left to do. Imagine a 14-year-old who's nearly as tall as their parents. You probably would not expect them to consistently make calm, thoughtful decisions in every situation. They're still learning, still developing emotionally, and still figuring out how to navigate the world. And our puppies aren't very different from that example. They may look mature on the outside, but internally, they're still going through enormous stages. During adolescence, hormones begin to change. Dogs reach sexual maturity, their brains continue developing, and the way they interact with the world starts to shift. Some dogs become more adventurous. Some become more cautious. Some suddenly seem fascinated by every squirrel, leaf, bird, or blowing plastic bag they encounter. Others become more interested in other dogs than they are in the person holding the leash. And many owners experience what feels like the most confusing change of all. Their puppy, the one who seemed so eager to learn, happy to listen, and excited to work with them, suddenly appears to forget everything. The cues they've practiced for months seem to disappear. Recall becomes unreliable. Walking politely on leash feels like a distant memory. You start asking yourself questions like, did I do something wrong? Are they just being stubborn? Are they trying to test me? These are incredibly common questions, but they're also based on a misunderstanding of what's happening. Adolescence isn't a sign that your training has failed. It's not your dog deciding they don't respect you anymore, and it's certainly not evidence that they're trying to make your life difficult. Instead, it's a normal stage of development, a period where the brain is reorganizing itself while your dog learns how to balance curiosity, independence, emotions, and self-control. In many ways, adolescence is exactly what evolution intended. You see, as puppies grow older, they naturally become more interested in exploring the world around them. If young animals never developed curiosity or independence, they wouldn't learn how to survive beyond the safety of their family group. That growing independence serves an important purpose, but for those of us sharing our homes with dogs, it can feel like our once attentive puppy has suddenly developed a whole new set of priorities. And that's okay. In fact, it should be expected. The most important thing isn't preventing adolescence from happening because, let's be honest, you can't. The goal is to understand what's happening, adjusting your expectations, and continuing to guide your dog through this stage without losing sight of the wonderful adult they're still becoming. Because while adolescence can absolutely be messy, it's also temporary. And with patience, consistency, and a little understanding of what's happening beneath the surface, this stage becomes much less frustrating and much easier to navigate together. So now that we know what adolescence is, let's take a closer look at why it happens. The answer lies inside the brain. And while we still have plenty to learn about canine brain development, researchers have found that adolescence is a period of remarkable change. It's a time when the brain is reorganizing itself, strengthening some connections, trimming away others, and preparing for adulthood. In other words, your dog's brain is under construction. That doesn't mean they're starting over. Everything they've learned hasn't disappeared, but the way they process information, respond to emotions, and make decisions is changing. One of the biggest shifts happens in the balance between emotion and self-control. The parts of the brain involved in excitement, emotion, and seeking rewards become highly active during adolescence. Meanwhile, the areas involved in impulse control, planning, and thoughtful decision-making are still maturing. If that sounds familiar, it's because we see something very similar in human teenagers. It's one reason adolescents, whether we're talking about 2 legs or 4, often seem to act before they think. Let's imagine your dog spotting a rabbit across the yard. As a puppy, maybe they noticed it, but they were still very focused on you. As an adolescent, their brain is saying, "It's a rabbit! Chase it! We can think about everything else later!" They basically react before thinking because the emotional centers of their brain are maturing faster than the thinking centers. That doesn't mean they suddenly forgot the cue to leave it. It means the excitement of the moment is competing with everything you've ever taught them. And sometimes, excitement wins. Another decently large change involves motivation. When puppies are younger, they're naturally inclined to stay close to familiar caregivers. From an evolutionary perspective, that makes total sense. Staying near the family group keeps young animals safe while they're still vulnerable. But as they grow older, nature starts nudging them toward independence. The world becomes more interesting, more exciting, more rewarding. A new scent on the breeze, a dog across the street, a squirrel darting up a tree, a patch of grass that's been visited by half the neighborhood. Suddenly, everything feels worth investigating. Yesterday, you were the most fascinating thing in the entire universe. But today, you've been demoted, and apparently, a leaf blowing across the sidewalk has taken first place. Not permanently, but for about 37 seconds while your dog investigates the world's most incredible leaf. Sometimes owners interpret this as their dog loving them less. But that's not what's happening at all. Your relationship with them hasn't become less important, it's just that the list of things competing for your dog's attention has gotten a whole lot longer. Think about a human teenager discovering new hobbies, new friends, or learning to drive. Now, they still love their family, but they're just becoming more interested in the world beyond it. And dogs go through a very similar shift. Another piece of the adolescent puzzle is something called a secondary fear period. Just as puppies go through their own fear period, many dogs experience another one during adolescence. This can catch owners completely off guard. A dog who confidently walked past garbage cans for months suddenly refuses to go near one. A friendly puppy starts barking at strangers. A dog who loved visiting the park suddenly seems hesitant around unfamiliar people or even objects. These reactions don't necessarily mean something traumatic happened. Sometimes they're simply part of normal development. The important thing during these periods isn't to force your dog to confront what they're worried about. Instead, we want to help them build confidence by giving them space, allowing them to observe, and creating positive experience at a pace they can handle. Confidence isn't built by proving there's nothing to fear, it's built by learning that even when something feels uncertain, they can safely navigate it. Adolescence also brings a dramatic increase in environmental awareness. It's almost as though someone turned the brightness up on the world. Smells become more compelling, sounds grab their attention, movement catches their eye. If you've ever wondered why your adolescent dog stops every few feet on a walk to sniff something invisible, I can tell you that it's their brain gathering information. For dogs, sniffing isn't just smelling, it's reading the world. Every scent tells them who walked here and how recently they passed by. It's an incredible amount of information that's packed into something we humans don't even notice. As their brains mature, they become more interested in collecting all of that information. It doesn't mean every walk should become a free-for-all, but it does remind us that exploration is an important part of being a dog. When we understand these developmental changes, many behaviors that once felt frustrating start making a whole lot more sense, which makes for a very different perspective, and often it's a much more compassionate one. Because underneath all of those forgotten cues, impulsive decisions, and distracted moments, your dog is still learning. They're still growing. And they're still becoming the adults they'll eventually be. So now that we understand some of the changes happening beneath the surface, let's talk about what those changes actually look like in everyday life. Because adolescence has a way of showing up in behaviors that make even the most experienced dog owners wonder what happened to their sweet little puppy. So now that we've talked about what's happening inside the adolescent brain, let's talk about what it looks like on the outside. Because this is usually the point where owners start wondering if something has happened or gone terribly wrong. Maybe they used to come running every time you called. And now they glance in your direction, pause for a moment, and you'll feel hopeful, and then they'll continue sniffing the same patch of grass like your voice was merely a suggestion. It's almost impressive. Suddenly, every walk feels less like a relaxing stroll and more like you've accidentally entered a amateur dog sledding competition. If any of that sounds familiar, I can assure you you're in very good company. These are some of the most common concerns trainers hear from owners of adolescent dogs. Let's start with the big one. My dog forgot everything, or at least that's what it feels like. The cues they seem to know so well suddenly become inconsistent. Sit takes a few seconds longer. Down happens only if nothing else is going on. Recall, well, sometimes it's excellent, and other times it's as though your dog has never heard the word before. But here's the important thing. Learning isn't erased. Your dog hasn't deleted months of training from their memory. What's changing is their ability to perform those behaviors consistently when the world is full of distractions. It's amazing how quickly we can go from, my dog is a genius, to, does my dog even know their own name anymore? Knowing something and choosing to do it under difficult circumstances are two very different skills. Think about it this way. Imagine someone asks you a simple math question while you're sitting quietly in your living room. Easy, right? Now, imagine they ask you that exact same question while you're riding a roller coaster. Or maybe while you're standing on stage in front of thousands of people. You still know the answer, it's just much harder to access it when your brain is busy processing everything else. For adolescent dogs, the world often feels like that roller coaster. There's just so much happening around them that responding to a cue becomes much more difficult. Another behavior owners often describe is what they call selective hearing. They hear me when I open the treat bag, but suddenly they can't hear me when I call them. For our dog Jupiter, it's truly amazing how she can hear us quietly peel open a banana from about 3 rooms away. What most people find interesting is that their dog can hear them open a specific bag of food or treats from a distance, but come suddenly becomes difficult when there's a squirrel involved. It's funny, but it's also understandable why it feels so personal. But the reality is that hearing isn't the problem. Motivation is. Dogs are constantly weighing the value of different choices. If your dog is deciding between a piece of kibble and chasing a rabbit, those two rewards aren't exactly equally valuable. The rabbit might be worth 100 points, and the kibble might be worth about 5. From your dog's perspective, the decision makes perfect sense. That doesn't mean they'll never come when called again. It simply means that we have to continue building the value of responding to us, especially in environments filled with distractions. And it definitely means that we have to come prepared with higher value treats. Another change many owners notice is increased energy. Some dogs who were relatively calm puppies can suddenly seem restless. They're ready to explore, ready to investigate, and ready to interact with everything around them. Sometimes owners assume this means they simply need more physical exercise, and while exercise is certainly important, it's only part of the picture. Remember everything we talked about in the last segment? Maybe even everything we talked about in a previous episode about puppies? Their brain is hungry for information. That means mental enrichment is just as valuable as physical activity. Sometimes a sniffari walk or a food puzzle can be more satisfying than adding another mile to your walk. Your normal walk, that is. Another behavior that surprises people is that mouthiness can make a comeback. Just when you thought the puppy biting phase was over, your adolescent dog starts grabbing sleeves, tugging on toys with a little more enthusiasm, and becoming mouthy during play. This doesn't necessarily mean aggression, and it doesn't mean that you've gone backward. Adolescence often brings increased excitement and reduced impulse control, and those two things together can make mouths much more active. Rather than punishing those moments, it's usually more productive to redirect your dog's energy toward appropriate toys or activities and reinforce calm interactions. Jumping on people often returns during adolescence for similar reasons. Excitement is high, self-control is still developing. Your dog isn't thinking, I'd really like to inconvenience this person by putting my paws on them. They're actually thinking, I'm so excited, I don't know what to do with my body. Our job is to teach them what to do instead. The same goes for pulling on the leash. Many owners assume their dog is trying to be dominant or intentionally difficult, but think back to everything we discussed about brain development. The world has become endlessly fascinating. Every tree holds new scents, every breeze carries information, every bird, squirrel, rabbit, or passing dog captures attention. With all of that new information, of course loose leash walking becomes harder. Your dog isn't necessarily choosing to ignore you. They're trying to process an environment that's suddenly more stimulating than it was just a few months ago. You may also notice more barking. Dogs often become more aware of their surroundings during adolescence. Things they barely noticed before may suddenly seem worthy of investigating. That person walking down the sidewalk, the delivery truck, the neighbor bringing in groceries. Barking doesn't automatically mean your dog is becoming protective or aggressive. Sometimes it's simply a sign that they're paying more attention to the world around them and still learning how to respond appropriately. Another common change is increased independence. Many puppies naturally stay close to their owners. Then adolescence arrives, and suddenly your dog wants to wander farther ahead on walks, investigate every corner of the yard, or spend a little less time checking in with you. That growing independence can feel disappointing, especially if you loved how attentive your puppy used to be. But remember, independence is a normal developmental milestone. The goal isn't to prevent your dog from becoming independent, it's to teach them that choosing to reconnect with you is rewarding. And finally, in this section, let's talk about what many people call testing boundaries. Maybe your dog never touched the shoes by the front door until one day they do. Maybe they've learned they're not allowed on the couch until suddenly they've sprawled across it when you walk into the room. If stealing one sock started a really fun game of please give that back, congratulations. You've probably accidentally made sock theft part of the entertainment schedule. It's tempting to think that they're challenging your authority, but I can assure you they're not planning acts of rebellion. They're learners, and because they're scientists as puppies, they experiment as adolescents. If something worked once, they'll probably try it again. If stealing a sock led to a fun game of chase, well, from your dog's perspective, that's valuable information. The behavior wasn't about defiance, it was about learning what happens next. When we understand adolescent behavior through the lens of development instead of disobedience, it becomes much easier to respond with patience instead of frustration. That doesn't mean that we ignore unwanted behavior. It means we recognize that our dogs still need guidance, not because they're trying to make life difficult, but because they're still learning how to make good choices in a world that's suddenly become much bigger, much more exciting, and much harder to navigate. The good news is that this stage doesn't last forever, and there are plenty of things we can do to help our teenage dogs succeed instead of simply waiting for them to grow out of it. And that's exactly what we'll explore next. Let's focus on the question every owner is probably asking. Okay, so what should I actually do? The encouraging news is that you don't need a completely different training plan. You don't need to start over from scratch, and you certainly don't need to convince your dog that you're the boss. What adolescence usually calls for is something much simpler: patience, consistency, and realistic expectations. Let's start with that last one because I think it's one of the most important concepts in this entire episode. Lower your expectations, but don't lower your standards. Those two things might sound familiar, but they're actually very different. Lowering your expectations means recognizing that your teenage dog probably isn't going to perform with the same consistency they did in your quiet living room 6 months ago. They're learning to navigate distractions, changing emotions, in a rapidly developing brain. Some days they'll surprise you with how well they do. Other days, it may feel like you've taken several steps backward. And that's okay, but we don't have to lower our standards. We still teach the behaviors we want, we still reinforce good choices, we still guide our dogs toward success. We're simply adjusting our expectations for how quickly or consistently those behaviors happen. Here's something I'd like you to keep in mind, though. Your expectations may need to become more realistic, but your consistency should not. Every calm response, every successful repetition, every reinforced behavior is another deposit into your dog's future. Next, let's talk about training itself. One mistake people often make is assuming they need to train harder. Longer sessions, more repetitions, more corrections. But adolescent dogs, and honestly, dogs as a whole, often learn best when training stays short, engaging, and rewarding. Instead of asking for 20 perfect repetitions of a cue, ask for 3 great ones. End while your dog is still successful and leave them wanting more. Celebrate the small successes. Training shouldn't feel like homework. It should feel like a conversation. It should feel like fun, and it should feel like a game that the two of you enjoy playing together. Another important strategy is something trainers call management. Management isn't giving up, it's preventing your dog from rehearsing behaviors that you don't want. Because every time a behavior is repeated, it becomes much easier to repeat again. And if a behavior works well, your dog will do it again and again. That's where management comes into play. If your teenage dog loves stealing socks, put the socks away. If they jump on visitors, use a leash or a baby gate while you teach a different greeting behavior instead. If they're likely to bolt out the front door, set up an extra barrier before opening it. Sometimes the smartest training decision isn't asking your dog to make a difficult choice, it's arranging the environment so they don't have to. Sometimes people worry management is somehow cheating when you should be fully training behaviors. But if I were trying to develop better eating habits, I'd probably move the cookies off the kitchen counter before relying entirely on willpower. Dogs deserve the same kind of support. There's an old saying in dog training: don't let your dog practice the behavior you're trying to change. And adolescence is when that advice becomes especially valuable. Another thing many adolescent dogs need is an outlet for all that curiosity I mentioned earlier. When people hear exercise, they often think about longer walks or more games of fetch. As we've already discussed, physical activity is certainly important, but for many dogs, mental enrichment can be just as valuable, sometimes even more. Remember, your dog's brain is craving information, so give them opportunities to use it. Scatter some kibble in the yard, hide treats for them to search for, or teach a new trick or two just for fun. That one is always my favorite. Allow time during walks for sniffing and exploration instead of treating every walk like a race from point A to point B. To us, it looks like your dog has spent 3 full minutes examining 1 square foot of grass, but to them, they've just read the neighborhood news. Let's also talk about freedom. Every dog owner looks forward to the day that their dog can be trusted off leash, left alone with the laundry basket, or even allowed to wander the house without supervision. Those are wonderful goals, but adolescence often reminds us that freedom isn't something we give all at once. It's something dogs earn through experience, through trust. Think of freedom as a privilege that grows alongside reliability. If your dog consistently makes good choices, they earn a little more freedom. If they're struggling, it's perfectly okay to temporarily provide more structure. That's not punishment, it's support. And punishment is definitely a topic worth mentioning here. When adolescent behaviors become frustrating, it's understandable that people look for ways to stop them quickly. And that's usually where punishment becomes involved. But remember what we've talked about throughout this episode. Most of these behaviors aren't signs of defiance, they're signs of development. Your dog isn't trying to defy you. They're learning. They're making mistakes. They're even becoming overwhelmed. Harsh corrections may suppress behaviors in the moment, but they don't teach your dog what you'd like them to do instead. Whenever possible, ask yourself which behavior you'd like to see instead. Then teach that. Reinforce that and make that behavior worthwhile. Dogs become good at the behaviors that are practiced and rewarded. Another thing I'd highly encourage not to stop during adolescence is socialization. This is actually one of the biggest hiccups in dog training knowledge that I see. People hear that puppies need socialization before 16 weeks and definitely before 12 weeks, so they work really hard during those early months, and then they stop. But healthy exposure to the world shouldn't end after puppyhood. Adolescent dogs still benefit from calmly experiencing new places, new sounds, different people, different environments, and different surfaces. And just like puppies, the goal isn't to overwhelm them, it's to continue helping them build positive associations with the world around them. And finally, give your dog permission to grow. Not every awkward stage needs fixing, not every mistake is a setback, and some lessons simply require time. When your teenage dog makes a poor choice, ask yourself, was this a training problem or was it a developmental moment? Sometimes the answer is both, but understanding the difference helps us respond with far more compassion because the dog standing in front of you today isn't quite finished growing just yet. They're still becoming who they'll be, and you have the incredible opportunity to shape that journey. Every walk, every training session, every patient response, and every successful repetition, those small, unremarkable moments, over weeks and over months, they quietly add up to something extraordinary. They add up to the adult dog you've been working toward all along. And while adolescence may feel like one of the longest stages of your dog's life so far, one day it'll be behind you. They'll still do goofy things and they'll still make you laugh, but eventually you'll wake up and you'll be living with an adult dog instead of a teenager. And you'll probably miss parts of those chaotic months more than you expected. The distractions won't quite seem so overwhelming, the impulsive moments will become less frequent, your conversations with your dog will feel smoother, more familiar, and more connected. Not because they magically woke up one morning as a perfect adult, but because the thousands of small moments of guidance, patience, and practice slowly shaped the dog standing beside you. And if you're in the middle of those teenage months right now, keep going. Absolutely keep going because you're probably making more progress than you realize. As we wrap up today's episode, I want to leave you with a few final words. If you're living with an adolescent dog right now, I know it can be exhausting. There are days when it feels like every walk is a challenge. There are even days when it feels like every moment is a challenge. Every training session tests your patience, and every time you think you've turned a corner, your dog surprises you with a brand new behavior you didn't even see coming. This stage can often feel like 3 steps backward and barely any steps forward, and it's easy to look at these moments and think you're falling behind. That all the time you've spent training somehow didn't matter. But here's what I hope you'll remember. Adolescence isn't proof that your training has failed. In many ways, it's proof that your training has succeeded and is currently being tested. Your dog isn't taking an exam they can pass perfectly on the first try. They're practicing. They're learning how to make good decisions in a world that's suddenly louder, more exciting, and much more distracting than it was just a few months ago, and that learning takes time. Just like us humans, they probably won't get it right every day. One of the things I admire most about dogs is that they don't wake up each morning trying to be perfect. They're simply responding to the information they have, the emotions they're experiencing, and the developmental stage they're currently in. When we understand that, frustration often gives way to empathy, and we begin asking things like, what might my dog be experiencing right now? And that one shift in perspective can change everything. It doesn't mean that we ignore unwanted behaviors. It doesn't mean that we stop training or lower our expectations forever. It simply means that we meet our dogs where they are while we continue to teach them where we'd like them to be. Because every walk, every successful recall, every calm greeting, and every choice to check back in with you instead of chasing a distraction, those moments matter. Even when progress feels slow, especially when progress feels slow, training isn't built in one perfect session. It's built through hundreds of ordinary moments that gradually become habits. And one day, often when you least expect it, you'll realize something has changed. You'll call your dog's name and they'll turn back toward you without hesitation. You'll walk past another dog and instead of pulling toward them, they'll glance at you first. You'll notice that the behaviors which once felt impossible have quietly become routine. Not because adolescence magically disappeared overnight, but because you stayed consistent with your guidance while your dog grew into the adult they were always becoming. If you're in the middle of the teenage phase right now, I hope this episode gives you something that every dog owner deserves during this stage. Perspective. Because this isn't the end of your training journey, it's simply one chapter of it. A messy, sometimes frustrating, often hilarious, and incredibly important chapter. Thank you for joining me here on the Recall Room. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd love for you to follow the podcast so you don't miss future conversations. And if you know someone who's currently wondering why their once perfect puppy suddenly seems to have selective hearing, consider sharing this episode with them. Sometimes knowing that this stage is normal can make all the difference. If you'd like to continue today's conversation, you'll find links to episode resources, recommended reading, and ways to connect with the show in the episode description. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking why, and remember, behind almost every wonderful adult dog is a teenager who once made their humans question absolutely everything. Take care of yourselves, and take care of your dogs. And tell your dog I said hi. The information in this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for veterinary or professional behavioral advice. Always consider your dog's unique needs, remember that every dog is different, and consult qualified professionals when appropriate or necessary.